Hello, this is Thomas Alexander. Welcome to our Array 4 Food Sensitivity Panel. This is the interpretation webinar for Array 4. Array 4 is our gluten-associated cross-reactive foods and food sensitivity panel. Now, people commonly get confused and think that the Array 4 is actually a direct measurement of cross-reactivity. So I want to clarify right in the beginning, the Array 4 is an IgA and IgG food sensitivity panel that looks at foods that are either commonly cross-reactive with gluten or introduced after a gluten-free diet or on a gluten-free diet, or lastly, foods that may be contaminated with gluten or common food allergens. This list looks at all the foods that are measured on the Array 4, but as we go down this webinar, we will further break it down into different subcategories. So, why do some patients not recover on a gluten-free diet? The literature shows that at least 25% of people with celiac disease do not improve symptomatically even after getting off gluten completely. Reason number one is that the patient, even though he or she believes is living gluten-free, may be getting exposures without knowing it. You and I know that gluten is pretty ubiquitous and found in all kinds of food products, particularly many synthetic food products, sauces, and dressings. We have a well on the Array 4 that looks at common gluten-containing grains besides wheat. It looks to see if there are the presence of these grains in the diet, which might explain the lack of improvement on the gluten-free diet. So the grains that we look at here are the rye, the barley, the spelt, and the Polish wheat. Polish wheat is also called camel's wheat, Egyptian wheat, or kamut. Another reason patients do not recover on a gluten-free diet is that they may be experiencing reactions to foods that cross-react with gliadin. Cross-reactivity simply means that food has an amino acid sequence very similar to one of the gluten amino acid sequences, and therefore can trick the immune system into thinking that person is still consuming gluten. So the immune system responds as if that person is still on a gluten diet, and the downstream consequences still continue. The common cross-reactive foods to gliadin are cow's milk, casein, casomorphin, milk butyrophilin, whey protein, milk chocolate, yeast, oats, millet, rice, and corn. Put it very simply, it's all the dairy products: yeast, oats, millet, rice, and corn. Now, in somebody with proper immune function, gliadin antibody will bind only to gliadin. It will not react to other foods like sweet potato or dairy because there simply is not a fit between the antibody and the antigen. What happens in cross-reactivity, due to some dysfunction of the immune system now starts to read a certain protein in casein, for example, as a gliadin protein, and therefore triggers the whole antibody response. Other reasons why some patients do not recover on a gluten-free diet. On going gluten-free, some of your patients may actually eat foods that they have never eaten before or have not eaten to a large degree. Their immune systems may now react to these newly introduced foods, and this immune response can trigger the continuation of these gluten-sensitive clinical symptomatology that was there before. Others may actually begin to overconsume foods to compensate for the lack of gluten in their diet and develop antibodies to these foods. Both of these scenarios can lead the person to continue to have adverse effects that are very similar to that of a gluten sensitivity reaction. The foods on the Array 4 can be divided into these categories. In orange, you find the dairy category. We put strong emphasis on dairy because after gluten, dairy has the most literature suggesting an immunogenic response in the human body. So we do recommend, as we recommend with all cross-reactive foods to gluten, that in a gluten-sensitive person, these be eliminated for life. With dairy, we recommend that people who react to one dairy product get off all dairy products and do so for life, possibly. Gluten-containing grains, we already looked at: rye, barley, spelt, and Polish wheat. The next category is foods that are commonly contaminated with gluten. Oats, as you all know, is often processed or transported in granaries that also have other gluten-containing grains in it, and therefore can often be cross-contaminated. However, oats also has another mechanism by which they can trigger an immune response, and that is cross-reactivity to gluten, which we will talk about later. And lastly, coffee has a filler in it that we'll talk about that often has gluten. So the next category looks at foods that cross-react with gluten. We've already talked about this. It's all of the dairy products, oats, yeast, millet, corn, and rice. The reason oats is here is that certain species of oats have been shown to be highly identical by way of amino acid sequences to gluten, and therefore can trigger a cross-reaction. This is why we recommend that even gluten-free oats be eliminated in somebody with a gluten reaction, because gluten-free oats simply means that it's not contaminated with gluten. The next category is newly introduced foods on a gluten-free diet that we discussed previously. Sesame, hemp, buckwheat, sorghum, amaranth, quinoa, tapioca, and teff are grains that are often used in gluten-free products and therefore can start to trigger immune responses in the human body. The two common food allergens that we look at on the array 4 are soybean and egg. And lastly, a food that is overconsumed on a gluten-free diet is, of course, the good old potato, which is why we are looking for possible immune reactions to potato on the array 4.